we shall overcome. Though I join hands so often with students and others behind jail bars singing it, we shall overcome. Sometimes we've had tears in our eyes when we joined together to sing it, but we still decided to sing it. We shall overcome. No, before this victory is won, some will have to get thrown in jail some more, but we shall overcome. Don't worry about us. Before the victory is won, some of us will lose jobs, but we shall overcome. Before the victory is won, even some will have to face physical death. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent psychological death, then nothing shall be more redemptive. We shall overcome. Before the victory is won, some will be misunderstood and called bad names and dismissed as rabble-rousers and agitators, but we shall overcome. And I'll tell you why. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. Behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. And with this faith, we will go out and adjourn the councils of despair and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. And we will be able to rise from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope. And this will be a great America. We will be the participants in making it so. And so as I leave you this evening, I say, walk together, children. Don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the corner. We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. Though I join hands so often with students and others behind jail bars singing it, we shall overcome. Sometimes we've had tears in our eyes when we joined together to sing it, but we still decided to sing it. We shall overcome. No, before this victory is won, some will have to get thrown in jail some more, but we shall overcome. Don't worry about us. Before the victory is won, some of us will lose jobs, but we shall overcome. Before the victory is won, even some will have to face physical death. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their...
Hey, good afternoon. Yoo-hoo! Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I was trying to wait for the White River Valley High School. Are they on their way? Okay, I know it's cold. They normally walk from the high school. Well, good afternoon. I'm Shirley Jefferson. I'm the Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Relations here at this lovely, lovely law school. I'm telling you. It is so great to see so many students and neighbors and friends here today. This is our annual Dr. Martin Luther King program, and I always get excited about this day. I had an opportunity to meet in March with Dr. King. I'm from Selma, Alabama. I also have someone else here from Selma, Alabama, Mr. John Green. Yep. So I just want to say that I think some of you heard Dr. King, his speech, "We shall overcome," as we were coming through. And we played that for a reason, because I know that some of the things that Dr. King dreamed of and wanted us to do, we still have a lot of work to do, and we can do them. We can do them all together. Also, I would like to acknowledge Ethan, who's from Senator Bernie Sanders' office. He has a letter from from the representative, from the senator to read. I don't know if we're going to have enough time, but I guess the high school is coming on up in here. So maybe while they're trying to get settled, why don't you come up and you read that? And then after he reads the letter from the senator, what I would like for us to do is to stand and we're going to sing "We Shall Overcome." We're doing something a little different this year. We normally start with the African American anthem, "Lift Every Voice and Sing." But we're going to start with "We Shall Overcome" this time. And we usually crisscross, but you don't have to do it this time. I understand there's a lot of codes going around. So you could just stand at that time, but right now, we're going to hear from Ethan, then we're going to have Nikija Fralin, and then we're going to hear from our president. We are following the order of the program. So come right on in, high school kids and your teachers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Avendano Lawrence. I'm an outreach representative for Senator Sanders. So happy to be here with you. Thank you all for being here. I'll read a brief letter from the senator about this moment and a note of gratitude for you all today and those who helped organize this. Dear friends, thank you for coming together in celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I want to thank Vice President Shirley Jefferson and Vermont Law and Graduate School for organizing this important event. As I stand with you in this show of celebration of Dr. King's life, I also recognize that we are in an incredibly difficult moment as a country. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We are living in two Americas. In the first, the three wealthiest men, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg, own more wealth than the bottom half of our society, over 165 million, and their wealth is skyrocketing. Now Donald Trump is rewarding some of those billionaires who gave to his campaign with top roles in the federal government. The billionaires chosen by Trump to serve in his administration have a combined wealth of at least $383 billion, a number higher than the GDP of 172 countries. Yet in that second America, millions of people are made disposable and are struggling just to provide for the basic necessities of life. In this America, over 60% of our people live paycheck to paycheck, millions work for starvation wages, 85 million are uninsured or underinsured, and over 60,000 die each year because they can't afford to go to the doctor on time. The cruel indignity of not being able to afford health care is an experience that knows no color boundaries. But it is an experience that is disproportionately shouldered by our black and brown neighbors and people in this country. These disparities expose the intersection of racism, classism, and greed that is destroying the social fabric of America. The status quo is absolutely unacceptable. Mr. Trump and other demagogues like him continue to use racism and bigotry to divide us. They turn neighbor on neighbor, worker against worker, to hide the fact that never before have so few had it so good and owned so much wealth. Racial justice must be a central component to combating income inequality. And if we are to create a government that works for all, not just the 1%. We still have much to learn from Dr. King's extraordinary life. As he urged us, we must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power in America. That statement is even more true today. He understood that when people stand together for a bright future, there is no force on earth which can stop them. Sincerely, Senator Bernie Sanders.
We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we are not afraid today.
We shall live in peace.
We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall live in peace someday.
We shall overcome. One more time.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome
Hi, everyone. Wonderful singing voices, might I just add. My name is Nakaja Fralin. I'm a 2L and the president of the Black Law Student Association. Today, I stand before you to share my thoughts on the current state of America. I ask that you allow my words to sit with you, try not to object, try not to defend, or focus on our differences. I also want to add that systematic racism is very complex, and when I speak of today is only the tip of the iceberg. I can't help but think and reflect on what Dr. Martin Luther King fought and died for today. When was the last time you listened to or read I Have a Dream? If I were to ask you, have we achieved the dream, what would you say? Many people think of the image Dr. King painted of little black boys and little black girls joining hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers. Now, if that's the only part of the dream that comes to mind, it might be easy to say, yes, we've achieved it. But reality is far more complex. Too many Americans believe systematic racism no longer exists. According to US News, 43% of white Americans, 20% of black Americans, 28% of Asian Americans, and 33% of Hispanics Americans deny its presence. Some might point to the diversity in this room as proof. Others who are non-people of color who've experienced poverty might show that as proof that their struggle proves that racism is no longer relevant. On the other spectrum, people of color who have achieved success may dismiss systematic racism based on their socioeconomic class. But let's unpack these perspectives. First, to those who equate racism no longer being relevant because of a diverse room, I must point out that integration isn't the same as equality. Just because no more white signs are available or visible acts of violence like lynching does not mean that racism is gone. It has evolved, subtle, insidious, and systematic. Second, to those who equate their own experiences with poverty with the Black experience, I hope to point out that this thinking stereotypes Black people as universally poor and erases the experiences of affluent Black individuals. And to people of color who dismiss racism based on their own socioeconomic success, I hope to point out that you're caught in the dream as well. Racism doesn't disappear with a person of color's income or education. Racism doesn't disappear when one changes their clothing, their hair, or their voice, unless it's behind the phone. And for those who may not have picked up on that, that's what Black people call our white people voice. It helps us achieve equal treatment on the phone that is denied by our natural voice. When looking historically, there have always been poor people of all races and various treatment of them. You may remember that prior to slavery and during the beginning stages, there was the use of indentured servitude, which was a contractual relationship between poor white ethnicities and those of richer backgrounds. These indentured servants worked alongside slaves in similar working conditions and experienced physical abuse. When we look back at American history, we can understand that all poor people suffered. And while understanding this, we do not erase or diminish the historical treatment of enslaved Black people. So why do we today? This isn't to discredit anyone's pain. I come from a family that struggled to make ends meet, where my parents had to choose between school clothing and keeping the lights on, and where the last meal sometimes was school lunch. I understand hardships, and I see you. But this shared experience of poverty does not erase the reality of being Black in America. Inclusivity of poverty does not erase racism. Inclusivity of wealth does not erase racism. Whether rich or poor, Black people across this nation all share the same feeling when the police get behind us. Parents across this country still have to teach their children about driving while Black. Black shoppers are still being followed around stores. A Black person's resume is still being overlooked because of their name, or maybe denied because of their natural hair. We live in a country where the man funding our president can say DEI means people die. Dr. King's dream never was just about sitting in the same room together or holding hands. Its deeper essence was about equality in every sense: justice, dignity, opportunity, and humanity. America has transitioned into a way that has sold the idea that Dr. King's dream was about inclusivity. And since we have that, we are free from racism. It's funny how a speech called "I Have a Dream" to wake America up has put us all to sleep. So today, I urge you to see the reality we collectively face. As MLK said, no one is free until we are all free. This is why we talk about being woke. The recent diminishing of this term has led folks astray of its true powerful meaning: awareness of injustice. To be woke is to raise from the dream of America and to see the true reality of Dr. King's true dream. I'm woke, and I hope you are too, because there's still a lot of work to do. Thank you. All right.
It's my pleasure to now introduce our two guest speakers, Dr. Ray Chin and John Green, and they're here with their spouses, who we also welcome, and Ray's dog, Dasher. Dr. Chin is a child family clinical psychologist, educated at Michigan State and at Harvard. He practices now in Vermont, where he's had a practice for many, many years. He specializes in neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism, executive function disorders, and trauma. Joining him, as I've already mentioned, are members of his family, his wife, and his lovely pooch. Before he became a psychologist, he earned a Master of Fine Arts in printmaking from the Rhode Island School of Design, and that is where serendipity brought him together with his friend, John Green, and they have been lifelong friends for the last 50 years. In his spare time, Dr. Chin teaches Kyoto, which is Japanese archery, as a meditation, and he volunteers with the Hartford Restorative Justice Center. He's a member of Tersu for Solidarity, founded by the descendants of those who were interned during World War II because of their Japanese American ancestry. Those of you who are students may remember the horrible Supreme Court decision in Korematsu versus the United States, which ranks with Dred Scott versus Sanford, in which the Supreme Court shamefully approved of the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II. Dr. Chin is a practicing Christian and Buddhist, which may explain why he would come to follow the magnificent teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who, as a pacifist and monk and theologian, taught how many of the world's great religious traditions can be harmonized, including Christianity and Buddhism. When I was talking to Ray earlier about how he became attracted to Thich Nhat Hanh, I said, did it have something to do with your father being a Buddhist and your mom being a devout Catholic? And he said yes, and that he was an altar boy. And I said, oh, well, so was I. We both learned the Mass in Latin a long time ago. He is happily married, and he has 4 sons and 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. His friend, John Green, whom will be joining him in this joint presentation, met, as I've already said, when they were students together at the Rhode Island School of Design. John spent a life as a healthcare worker and is now retired, and he spends his time volunteering, exercising, meditating, working, writing, and speaking out on behalf of issues of racial and social justice and equality. John's parents grew up in Selma, Alabama, which is also where our own Dr. Shirley Jefferson grew up. And John and Ray together share connections to the most intense days of the civil rights movement. To have roots in Selma is to have roots at the place that was the epicenter of perhaps the most violent confrontation in the history of the civil rights movement, the Edmund Pettus Bridge confrontation that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. And Ray, for his part, grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, a northern city, but also a city with a terrible history of having been racked by racism. And in the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination in 1968, experienced some of the greatest tensions. And indeed, the governor at the time had martial law in Wilmington, Delaware for nearly a year, as I recall. You'll find their presentation, which invites us to think reflectively about the connections between these 2 extraordinary world leaders, these 2 extraordinary people of peace, improbable from different parts of the world, a Buddhist monk from Southeast Asia and an African-American preacher and civil rights leader from the American South. I was mesmerized the first time I heard this presentation. I know you will be as well. Please join me in welcoming our 2 guest speakers, Dr. Ray Chin and John Green.
Whoa. I am so glad to be here. And I want to thank President Smola for inviting me to celebrate with you Martin Luther King Jr. Day here at this, prestigious law school. And I want to thank everyone for joining also online. I am especially happy to be in the presence of you who are training to be legal advocates in the front lines of the continued struggle for social justice in America. And this is an auspicious moment because tomorrow is the 3rd anniversary of Thich Nhat Hanh's death. He died on January 22nd in 2022 in his root temple, Tu Hin Temple in Hue, Vietnam. Okay? He was 95 years old. I also want to thank my friend and brother, actually my brother from another mother, John Green, for reading parts of Dr. King's speeches during my presentation. I also want to give a shout out to my parents, who are both deceased, Annie and Jin Pan Chin. My mother was a devout Catholic, and I was baptized a Catholic. My father was raised with the teachings of Confucius, Lao Tzu, and Buddha. Although he eventually was baptized as a Catholic after 13 years of sitting outside the church on Sundays reading the Chinese newspaper. And in their traditions, I am a practicing Buddhist Christian and know that my parents are smiling in the cosmos. So today I want to talk to you about the friendship between Martin Luther King Jr., a black Baptist minister, and Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. Occasionally, I will use the title Tay when referring to Thich Nhat Hanh. Tay is the Vietnamese word for teacher, as his followers called him. Now, Dr. King and Tay lived on opposite sides of the world, but once they met, they became brothers who shared a vision of peace in a beloved community, as Dr. King described his vision. Their story takes place from 1965 to 1968, back when I was 15 to 18 years old. And remember only the major events from the CBS Evening News reports with Walter Cronkite. I was totally unaware of the depth of their friendship, as many are today. Even the books, and the most recent one called King, a 600-page biography written by Jonathan Eig, only mentions briefly Thich Nhat Hanh. But I was fortunate enough to find a book by Mark Andrus called Brothers in the Beloved Community, that's the title, which really shed light on their friendship and what they experienced from each other because of it. When we think about Dr. King, we must often remember the year 1963, when he published his Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and later that year, I Have a Dream speech, given to an audience of 250,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. These speeches were the catalyst for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, with the strong support of President Lyndon Johnson. By 1964, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize and was admired by many Americans. In a Gallup poll that year, only Eisenhower, Winston Churchill, and Lyndon Johnson were more admired than Dr. King. However, by 1966, King wasn't even on the top 10 list of the Gallup poll and was disliked by 63% of Americans, in large part because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. He was labeled a communist sympathizer, and President Lyndon Johnson, who was ramping up the war in Vietnam, felt betrayed by Dr. King after he shepherded the civil rights laws. The FBI wiretapped his phone, looking for evidence that he was a communist and a philanderer, and Dr. King was under extreme stress, and the constant threats to him and his family took a toll on his health. While Dr. King was struggling in America, Thich Nhat Hanh was expressing ideas that rattled the Buddhist hierarchy. He promoted engaged Buddhism by encouraging monks and nuns to live among the people rather than in isolation in monasteries. He founded the School of Youth for Social Services that trained hundreds of monks and nuns to live, teach, and work among the villagers in Vietnam. Many of these engaged monks and nuns were killed by soldiers when they helped villagers regardless of their political beliefs. He also made enemies of the American-backed South Vietnamese government by calling for peace negotiations between the North and the South Vietnamese armies, as well as for the removal of all American forces from Southeast Asia. For this, he was branded a communist and eventually expelled from Vietnam in 1964. He lived in exile for 40 years until his return to Vietnam in 2005. And by the way, he spent some time in Vermont. Yeah. Thich Nhat Hanh described a foundational principle of Buddhism as interbeing, meaning the interconnection and interdependence of all beings and nature. He explained, if you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If a cloud is not here, the sheet of paper cannot be here either. So we can say that the cloud and the paper are or interbeing. And this echoed Dr. King's thoughts. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Now, back in America, Dr. King pondered how much he should protest the war. Some of his advisors cautioned him not to take his focus off the plight of African Americans. On the other hand, he saw the racial inequalities of military service. Blacks had disproportionately fewer draft deferments, more combat missions, and higher casualty rates than whites. In 1965, Dr. King wrote a letter, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a letter to Dr. King. I believe because he thought Dr. King fully understood the decades of suffering of the Vietnamese people, and he could speak with such sincerity and eloquence that it could change people's hearts and minds. In Tay's letter, later titled In Search of the Enemy of Man, he explained that Vietnamese Buddhist monks who set themselves on fire were not committing suicide, as the Western press described them. Tay wrote, "The monk who burns himself has lost neither courage nor hope, nor does he desire non-existence. On the contrary, he is very courageous and hopeful and aspires for something good in the future. He does not think that he is destroying himself. If he believes in the good fruition of his act of self-sacrifice for the sake of others." This resonated with Dr. King's use of the Greek word agape, which means brotherly and sacrificial love. He understood these monks and nuns were martyrs who bore witness to the suffering and injustice of both Vietnamese and Americans. In the letter, Thich Nhat Hanh also drew the parallel between their beliefs about nonviolence. Referring to the monks, he wrote, Their enemies are not man. They are intolerance, fanaticism, dictatorship, cupidity, hatred, and discrimination, which lie within the heart of man. I also believe with all my being that the struggle for equality and freedom you lead in Birmingham, Alabama, is not aimed at the whites, but only at intolerance, hatred, and discrimination. These are real enemies of man, not man himself. Tay's letter expanded Dr. King's view of the war beyond the government's propaganda and the constrained news media. He came to understand that the Vietnamese people were no different than the blacks in America in terms of their oppression by colonial powers. He believed that the war where poor people, both Vietnamese and American, fought and died to profit corporations. He also believed that the money spent on the war would be better spent at home to improve the lives of the poor in America. In 1966, Dr. King and Thich Nhat Hanh met for the first time in Chicago. And Tay told Dr. King that the Vietnamese called him a bodhisattva, that is, an enlightened being who devotes his life to the compassionate care of all sentient beings. A bodhisattva is the equivalent of a saint in Christianity. There is no transcript of what they said to each other, but I imagine that they discussed the similarity between Dr. King's beloved community and Thich Nhat Hanh's vision of a sangha, that is, in Tay's word, a loving, supportive community of practitioners realizing harmony, awareness, and liberation, and to the sangha I go for refuge. Their meeting was a catalyst for Dr. King to expand his focus from black civil rights to embrace the needs of all oppressed people in the world and to accuse corporate greed and the unquenchable consumerism that fueled poverty, racism, and war. He felt he had to protest all wars, not just the Vietnam War, if he was ever to realize his dream of the beloved community. Just days after their meeting, several poems by Thich Nhat Hanh were published in the New York Review. And here's one of them entitled, Peace. They woke me up this morning to tell me my brother had been killed in battle. Yet in the garden, uncurling moist petals, a new rose blooms on the bush. And I am alive, can still breathe the fragrance of roses and dung, eat, pray, and sleep. But when can I break my long silence? When can I speak the unuttered words that are choking me? On April 4th, 1967, Martin Luther King delivered his seminal sermon at the Riverside Church in New York City entitled, Beyond Vietnam, a Time to Break Silence. He declared his conscience left him no other choice but to speak out against the Vietnam War. He even admonished himself for being silent too long. He spoke directly to all Americans to end the carnage in Vietnam as a moral obligation. John? He protested the war as diverting Americans' tax dollars to kill others instead of helping the poor in America. He said,
I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and energy and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent.
he called out the hypocrisy of America as freedom-loving when it waged wars against peaceful revolutions for freedom in Southeast Asia to maintain its colonial control over natural resources while driving its people into poverty and hopelessness. He pointed out the hypocrisy of Americans describing themselves as liberators. His powerful words, whether he intended or not, echoed the Buddha's warning of the three poisons, that is, insatiable greed, hateful anger, and self-delusion that fueled all suffering.
We have destroyed their two most cherished institutions, the family and the village. We have destroyed their land and their crops. We have cooperated in the crushing of the nation's only non-communist revolutionary political force, the unified Buddhist Church. We have supported the enemies of the peasants of Saigon. We have corrupted their women and children and killed their men. What liberators?
He warned of the dire consequences by reciting the message of a Buddhist leader, who he did not name, but it was most likely Thich Nhat Hanh.
Each day the war goes on. The hatred increases in the heart of the Vietnamese and in the hearts of those of humanitarian instinct. The Americans are forcing even their friends into becoming their enemies. It is curious that the Americans, who calculate so carefully in the possibilities of military victory, do not realize that in the process they are incurring deep psychological and political defeat. The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom, and democracy, but the images of violence and militarism.
And Dr. King implored Americans to choose agape, that is, abiding love or charity, powerful enough to overcome hate.
This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concerns beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all men. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us.
He ended by describing his vision of the beloved community.
If we only make the right choice, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace. If we will make the right choice, we will be able to transform the jangling discord of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day all over America and all over the world, when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
His speech ignited a firestorm of criticism from media editorials, white liberals, the White House, and some black leaders. In a New York Times article, quote, Dr. King makes too facile a connection between the speeding up of the war in Vietnam and the slowing down of the war against poverty. A Life magazine article described his speech as, quote, demagogic slander that sounded like a script for Radio Hanoi. President Johnson refused to take Dr. King's calls anymore. Dr. King's closest advisors, the NAACP, and the Southern Christian Leadership Council criticized him for taking his eyes off the prize of Negro civil rights by including other people of other countries. On the other hand, the militant Black Panther Party criticized his continued focus on nonviolent protests. Despite the backlash, he continued to plan for the following year, in 1968, a Poor People's March to Washington with people of all races to end poverty. 1 year later, in 1968, he gave the I Have Been to the Mountaintop sermon in Memphis, Tennessee, in which he recounted the long history of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the face of beatings, jailings, and murders of African Americans. Sensing fear in the congregation and among civil rights activists in general, he addressed the constant death threats against him.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
His sermon that night was prophetic. The next day, on April 4th, 1968, he was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, exactly 1 year after he gave his Beyond Vietnam speech. Dr. King, like the Buddhist monks, saw his death as an offering rather than his life taken from him. He showed the world that death was not to be feared. He committed his life to the service of humanity, despite strong opposition to treating everyone as equal, regardless of skin color, nationality, caste, and so on. When Thich Nhat Hanh learned of his friend's death, he was devastated. In a letter to a mutual friend of his and Dr. King's, he wrote, "I did not sleep last night. They killed Martin Luther King. They killed us. I'm afraid the root of violence is so deep in the heart and mind and manner of this society. They killed them. They killed my hope. I do not know what to say. He made so great an impression on me. And this morning, I have the impression that I cannot bear the loss." Years later, Thich Nhat Hanh recalled, "I was in New York when I heard the news of his assassination. I was devastated. I could not eat. I could not sleep. I made a deep vow to continue building what he called the beloved community. Not only for myself, but for him also. I have done what I promised to Martin Luther King Jr., and I think that I have always felt his support." And Dr. King and Thich Nhat Hanh saw and felt the suffering on both sides of the war and refused to take either side. They refused to reduce suffering to simple zero-sum thinking, where one side's gain is the other side's loss. They refused the convenience of oversimplifying the causes of suffering as black or white, democracy or communism, liberal or conservative, north or south, friend or foe, life or death. Instead, they knew the sources of suffering were poverty, ignorance, the caste system, racism, materialism, colonialism, ideology, and so on. They knew these were driven by the three poisons that Buddha and Jesus warned against: greed, anger, and ignorance, at the expense of our common humanity. Moreover, they taught that being spiritual meant actively relieving the suffering of peasants, soldiers, leaders, and their families on all sides, as well as working with their governments to prioritize resources to address poverty, war, and ignorance. They taught everyone to practice agape, unconditional love, as Jesus preached. Three things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Today, we are confronted with the same moral dilemmas they faced during the Vietnam War as we struggle with wars in Gaza, Ukraine, Haiti, Sudan, and other places. We witness leaders in countries, including our own, adopting the authoritarian tactics of instilling fear and hate using propaganda, conspiracies, and xenophobia. We are witnessing the destruction of our ecosystem to feed insatiable greed. We are told who is right and who is wrong, who are the victims and who are the oppressors, who to love and who to hate, as well as who deserves to live in America. As an Asian American, I am especially worried and angered to see the revival of anti-Asian rhetoric and atrocities of the past 150 years. My great-grandfather was among the 20,000 Chinese who worked to build the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. However, once the railroad was completed and the gold mines were depleted, the Chinese sought other jobs. And soon they were accused of taking jobs away from whites. They were persecuted and forced to leave America. And this culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that barred any Chinese person from immigrating to America. In 1942, 125,000 Japanese Americans, entire families, were sent to concentration camps during World War II under Executive Order 9066, based on the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. This act was recently cited by Trump as the basis for his promised mass deportation of immigrants. Now, despite this tragic history, I take heart in the response of many Americans of all stripes. In 1898, Wong Ark Kim, an American-born Chinese man, went to China for a visit, but when he returned to America, he was not allowed to disembark. He and his lawyers filed a suit that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won. And this created the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment, which is now being challenged by Trump. My grandfather and father found ways around the Chinese Exclusion Act and entered America as paper sons of Chinese who are already living in America. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, officially apologizing for the wrongful internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and authorizing reparations to 100,000 survivors, and to, I quote, discourage the occurrence of similar injustices and violations of civil liberties in the future. Thus, these anti-immigrant laws were challenged by people of conscience, many of whom who were lawyers like you. These lawyers and Dr. King knew the difference between just laws and unjust laws. Dr. King wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail, which was a response to local clergymen who urged Dr. King to stop protesting because it was against the law to march and protest. But he would continue to protest against unjust laws because, quote, I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. So what am I to do? It is very hard to ignore injustice and hate, especially when you are the target. Striking back doesn't really help. I admit to reacting aggressively when I was younger and often causing harm to myself. Protesting allows me to vent my anger, but at times seems futile. And I can feel more angry if I'm ignored. At times, I have felt at loss about how to deal with my anger and worries over racism. Moreover, as a child psychologist, I am often asked to help children who have severe anger and mood disorders, and often because of trauma. So if I can't find a way to help myself deal with my anger and worry, then how am I supposed to help children, their parents, and teachers? The answer came to me after listening to thousands of children after over 40 years of practice. The children gave me the insight that the key to resolving anger, hate, and worry boils down to one thing: belongingness. That is the feeling of being valued and included. Indeed, belongingness is the essential ingredient of brotherly love. When you don't feel like you belong, then you will do whatever it takes to be noticed and accepted, even if it means doing hurtful things to get some attention or to alleviate suffering, if only temporarily. Those children who I worked with were often described as behavior problems. But I began to realize, after listening to them, that they felt like the only kid who couldn't do math or read, and that they were rarely invited to birthday parties or overnights, or that they were the last to be chosen on teams or class projects. They felt shunned. Thus, they feel the isolation and exclusion of many BIPOC Americans, immigrants, the homeless, and other disadvantaged people feel. And ironically, these are the same feelings of isolation and exclusion that prompted many to vote for Trump, who blamed it all on the immigrants and the Democrats. It is important not to confuse belongingness with tolerance. That is, putting up with racism with the hope that you will outlast racism that shows no end in sight. Promoting belongingness goes far beyond tolerance. In other words, just putting up with a bully is not the same as helping the bully to become your friend. So how can I speak out against racism and injustice as well as promote belongingness to a person I disagree with? First, I must remind myself every day that Dr. King and Tay would tell me to acknowledge that I am no different than those who irritate, annoy, and threaten me. I must admit that I have also acted impulsively, wanting more than I need and sometimes depriving others of their needs. I must admit having also acted aggressively towards those who block my desires. I must admit having used irrational ideas to justify my misjudgments and to harm others. Once I realized this, I cannot cast the first stone because I am not without sin, as Dr. King would remind me. And Tay would remind me that I am not separate from my interbeing sister and brother, and that harm to them is harm to me. If I practice this, and that's a big if, then I can better resist the impulse to hate and exclude others, thereby avoiding becoming the very person who I blame for my ills. And I want to emphasize this point. A prime reason for practicing belongingness is to avoid greed, hateful anger, and irrational thinking. I do not want to drink the three poisons that would make my life more unbearable. Second, I often recite a little prayer before a potential conflict. Oh God, grant me the grace to live in a space between impulse and action. Amen. This space allows me the opportunity to engage my skills of belongingness, which is the best way to respond to exclusion tactics that racists use when othering people. Belongingness is the refuge that many Christians and Buddhists believe in. It is the key to the beloved community that Dr. King and Tay both envisioned. When fear and threat are reduced, my amygdala, that is the part of my brain that detects threat, stops sending alarms to the rest of my mind and body, My heart slows, my breathing deepens, muscles relax as the fight-flight response lessens. Eventually, my caution gives way to curiosity, one of the 7 awakening factors of Buddhism. Third, I must develop curiosity by listening without judging, comparing, and fixing. And this is very hard to do without practice. But once you can let go of judging, comparing, and fixing, even briefly, curiosity will arise and will gradually increase with practice. Moreover, my non-judgmental curiosity is less likely to trigger the other person's amygdala, and he or she will begin to speak with less fear as their body and mind starts to calm. When people feel safe with each other, they are naturally curious and begin to share their stories. We may share our stories of how we learn the beliefs that guide our actions. Invariably, we will find some shared belief or common life experience that begins the building of connections between us. This doesn't always result in agreement, nor should we expect it. Our goal is not to persuade others to change their minds to suit us. Rather, the goal is to learn about a real person, to supplant a racist stereotype, or a conspiracy theory, or a hateful ideology. Then we can disagree without hate and potentially work towards a shared goal. Finally, what might Dr. King and Tay think of you? I believe they would be overjoyed seeing their beloved community realized. They would feel in you the spirit of Dr. King's Students for a Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, SNCC, fighting racism. They would feel the spirit of Tay's nuns and monks who joined the School of Youth for Social Services to promote peace in the midst of war. They would see people of all colors and all sexual identities, of all religions and non-religious, of all means from poor to rich, who will fight for justice. They would see people who know the difference between legal, ethical, and moral decision-making. They would be happy to see legal advocates who will defend the inalienable rights of citizens, immigrants, and animals against hate, tyranny, and indifference. They would smile at those who promote restorative justice as a far better way to heal than the current broken penal system. They would feel hope as you work to revise business and tax laws to create a more equitable way to share civic responsibility. They would feel joy seeing you fight to preserve our planet, to keep it livable for generations to come, against the short-sighted greed to plunder this earth. They would join hands with you as you craft international treaties as an alternative to war. I believe they would bow to you who embody the phrase, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You who are compassionate and believe there is enough for everyone to liberate us from the chains of greed. You who would strive towards a justice based on our inseparability and the need for each other. In deep gratitude, I bow to the beloved community. May our time together benefit all interbeings, whether they be rooted in the earth, swim in the waters, fly in the sky above, or walk the earth, omitting none, omitting none, omitting none.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, John. One of our students is going to present you with a small token of our thanks, and then we will all together lift every voice and sing.
Can we have one more round of applause for everyone for speaking today, as well as Nakaija for her lovely introduction. I know we're running low on time, so I think we're just going to do one last song to close out. But thank you again for coming to this wonderful event. It's great to see so many people out here.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the we have come, treading our path through the blood of the Slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright stars is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, that who has brought us thus far on the way, that who has guided night, led us into the light, lead us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forgot thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Thank you. That concludes our program.